Hey everyone, welcome back to English Podcast 2.0. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a technique that can really help you speak English more fluently. It's called shadowing. And it's all about, making learning feel easy and natural. Almost like you're just like enjoying a good story.
Yeah. It's amazing how this technique kind of taps into the way we all learned language as children,
Yeah.
through immersion and repetition.
Right. It's just like when you were a kid, you kind of pick up words and phrases just by hearing them over and over again.
Exactly. And shadowing kind of takes advantage of that natural learning process, but in a more structured way.
So how does it actually work? Can you break it down for us?
Absolutely. The first step is what we call immersion. So imagine you're listening to a native English speaker telling a story, right? You're not just trying to understand every single word, but you're also absorbing the rhythm, the flow, the intonation. You're getting a feel for the overall context.
Okay, so it's like dipping your toes in the language pool before you kind of jump all the way in.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second step, active repetition. And this is where the shadowing comes in. Now you listen to each sentence and repeat it out loud, trying to match the speaker's pronunciation and intonation as closely as you can.
So you're basically echoing the speaker like a vocal workout for your English, skills.
Yes, precisely. Think of it as like mimicking an actor or a singer. You're trying to capture not just the words, but also the way that they deliver them, the nuances, the emphasis, the
Yeah.
emotion.
Okay, that makes sense. So by echoing the speaker, we're training our mouths and our ears to get comfortable with the sounds of English.
You got it. And as you practice, you'll notice yourself becoming more attuned to those subtle details of pronunciation, things like where to stress syllables or how to connect words smoothly. Your spoken English will start to sound more natural and fluent.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
But what about the third step? How do we actually use this technique to speak more confidently?
Well, in the third step, you take everything you've learned and you put it all together. You repeat the entire story this time without pausing, focusing on fluency and natural delivery. You're no longer just echoing individual sentences, but you're stringing them together, creating a flow.
So it's like taking all those individual vocal workouts and then you're putting them into a performance.
I like that analogy. And this is where you start to internalize the language patterns. You're no longer just repeating words, you're thinking and speaking in English more spontaneously.
That sounds amazing, but it also seems like it could be a bit challenging at first. What advice would you give to someone who's maybe trying shadowing for the very first time?
I would say start small. Don't try to shadow an entire movie right away. Maybe begin with short audio clips or even just a few sentences. Focus on accuracy first, and then gradually work your way up to longer passages. And remember, consistency is key. Just like with any skill, the more you practice, the better you'll become.
So it's all about building those good habits and sticking with it. But what about vocabulary? I mean, wouldn't we need to expand our vocabulary along the way?
Absolutely. Vocabulary is essential. It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation of words before you can start adding more complex structures.
So how do we go about building that foundation? What are some effective ways to learn new words?
Well, one powerful technique is to actively engage with the language. Don't just passively listen or read. Take notes, write down new words and their meanings, look up synonyms and antonyms, create flashcards, or use online vocabulary builders. The key is to make the language your own, to personalize it.
Right. It's like building your own kind of personal dictionary, like a collection of words that you've encountered and understood, in context.
Exactly. And when you encounter a new word, don't just memorize its definition. Try to use it in a sentence right away. That way you're not just learning the word, but you're also learning how to use it in a real-world situation.
That's great advice. So we've got the shadowing technique and we've got vocabulary building Kate. What else can we do to kind of boost our confidence when speaking English?
Well, one of the best things you can do is to find opportunities to actually speak the language.
Yeah, but what if you don't have anyone to practice with?
Oh, there are so many options these days. You could join an online language exchange community, you can find a conversation partner, or even just record yourself speaking English and listen back to it.
I guess the important thing is to just get out there and practice without being afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone makes mistakes. It's a natural part of the learning process. In fact, mistakes are valuable because they help us learn and grow.
Right. It's like learning to ride a bike. You're going to fall a few times before you get the hang of it, but eventually you'll be riding smoothly.
That's a great analogy. And just like with riding a bike, the more you practice, the more confident you'll become. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there and speak English as much as possible.
Great advice. So we've talked about shadowing, we've talked about vocabulary building and finding opportunities to practice. Is there anything else we should keep in mind as we're on this journey to improve our English?
One thing that's really important is to set realistic goals. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. Language learning takes time and effort.
So instead of trying to climb the mountain all at once, we should focus on taking small steps consistently.
Exactly. And remember to celebrate those small victories along the way. Every new word you learn, every conversation you have, every time you feel more confident speaking English, that's something to be proud of.
I like that. It's about focusing on the progress we're making and enjoying the journey.
Absolutely. Learning a language should be a fun and rewarding experience. So find what works for you, what you enjoy, and what keeps you motivated. And most importantly, don't give up.
That's really inspiring. So for all of you listening out there, remember that you can achieve your language goals with the right approach and a positive attitude. That's great to hear those encouraging words. Speaking of confidence, I've always found that pronunciation is one of the things that can hold people back. Do you have any tips on how to improve pronunciation, like specifically?
Oh, absolutely. Shadowing is actually a fantastic way to work on your pronunciation because you're actively trying to mimic the sounds and the rhythms of a native speaker. But beyond that, I would say pay attention to the sounds that are difficult for you.
Yeah, like those tricky vowel sounds or consonant clusters that we tend to stumble over.
Exactly. And, there are tons of resources online that can help you break down those difficult sounds and practice them in isolation. You can also look for pronunciation guides or videos that focus on specific accents if that's something you're interested in.
Okay, so we've got shadowing, we've got focusing on difficult sounds. Any other pronunciation tips?
One thing that really helped me was recording myself speaking and then listening back to it. It can be a little cringy at first, but it's so helpful because you can really hear where you're making mistakes and then you can work on correcting them.
Right, it's like having a personal pronunciation coach, but without the awkwardness of having someone watch you practice.
Exactly. And another thing I'd recommend is to expose yourself to as much authentic English as possible.
Oh,
Watch movies, listen to podcasts, read books, and just try to immerse yourself in the language.
yeah, it's like training your ear to recognize the different sounds and patterns of English.
Yeah.
The more you hear it, the more familiar it becomes.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable with the sounds, you'll start to notice them when you're speaking, and you'll be able to self-correct more easily.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
So it's really about building that awareness of how the language sounds and then practicing until it becomes more natural.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment. Try different accents, play with different intonations, see what feels comfortable for you.
Yeah, it's all about finding your own voice in English.
Absolutely. And remember, language is a living thing. It's constantly evolving. So don't get too hung up on being perfect. Just focus on communicating clearly and confidently and have fun with it.
I love that. It's about embracing the journey and enjoying the process of learning. But speaking of the journey, we haven't really talked about the emotional side of language learning, the ups and downs, the moments of frustration and the moments of triumph.
Oh, absolutely. Language learning is an emotional roller coaster. There are days when you feel like you're making so much progress, and then there are days when you feel like you're stuck in a rut.
Yeah,
And it's important to acknowledge those feelings and to be kind to yourself.
right. It's like running a marathon. There are going to be times when you feel tired and discouraged,
Yeah.
but you have to keep pushing forward and remind yourself why you started running in the first place.
That's such a great analogy.
Yeah.
And just like with running a marathon, it's important to have a support system. Surround yourself with people who encourage you and who understand the challenges you're facing.
Right. Whether it's a language exchange partner, a tutor, or even just a friend who's also learning English, having someone to share your struggles and successes with can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's like having a cheerleader in your corner, someone who believes in you and who helps you stay motivated when you're feeling down.
That's so important. So we've
Yeah.
talked about the technical aspects of language learning, like shadowing and pronunciation, but we also need to remember the importance of taking care of our emotional well-being.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance between pushing yourself and being kind to yourself, celebrating the small victories and acknowledging the challenges.
Right, and remembering that language learning is a journey, not a destination. It's something that we can continue to learn and grow from throughout our lives.
Exactly. And the more we embrace that journey, the more rewarding it will be.
So what would you say to someone who's just starting out on their English learning journey? What advice would you give them?
I would say be patient with yourself. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. It takes time and effort. Set realistic goals and focus on making small, consistent progress.
So instead of trying to climb Mount Everest in a day, we should focus on taking one step at a time.
Exactly. And find what works for you. Experiment with different learning methods and resources. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning.
Right. It's all about finding the tools and techniques that resonate with your own learning style.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are a natural part of the learning process. In fact, they're opportunities to learn and grow.
Right. It's like learning to walk. You're going to stumble a few times before you get the hang of it.
And most importantly, have fun. Language learning should be an enjoyable experience, so find ways to make it fun and engaging for yourself.
That's great advice. So for all of you listening out there, remember that you can achieve your language goals with the right mindset and a positive attitude. And don't forget to enjoy the journey.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into language learning. We've covered a lot of ground today, from shadowing to vocabulary, building pronunciation, tips, the emotional side of learning.
Yeah, we certainly have, and I hope our listeners have found it helpful and encouraging.
Me too. One thing I've learned from our conversation today is that there's no magic bullet when it comes to language learning. It's all about finding what works for you and putting in the time and the effort.
Absolutely. It's a journey, and like any journey, it has its ups and downs, its twists and turns. But with the right mindset and the right tools, we can all achieve our language goals.
Exactly. And I think it's so important to remember that language learning is not just about memorizing grammar rules or vocabulary lists. It's about connecting with other people, with different cultures, with different ways of seeing the world. That's so true. Language opens doors, it creates opportunities, and it enriches our lives in countless ways.
So for anyone out there who's thinking about learning English or any other language for that matter, I say go for it. Embrace the challenge, embrace the journey, and most importantly, embrace the joy of learning.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are so many resources available online and in your community. Find a language partner, join a conversation group, or take a class. Surround yourself with people who support your goals and who make the learning process fun and engaging.
That's great advice. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of English Podcast 2.0. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise. And to all our listeners out there, happy learning and keep practicing.